I found my wife's wedding ring in a pawn shop window 2 towns over, and the clerk said she sold it herself. The ring was still warm from the lights when I held it, like an accusation I couldn't drop. There are betrayals that crash through your life like a drunk driver, loud and smoking. And then there are the quiet ones, the kind that move your furniture an inch at a time until you wake up in a house you hardly recognize. I was 61 when I learned the second kind could ruin you just as cleanly. Linda and I had been married 37 years. We weren't one of those showy couples who posted anniversary tributes or held hands like teenagers. We were steady, practical, the kind of marriage built on shared calendars and paid off mortgages. Our son, Eric, was grown with a family of his own out in Arizona. Our daughter, Maggie, lived a few miles away and visited on Sundays, bringing her laundry and her opinions. I used to joke that my retirement plan was equal parts 401k and Maggie's guilt. Linda worked part-time at the local library. I ran a small contracting business until my back began negotiating terms I couldn't afford. We talked about downsizing, maybe a condo near the coast. We even had a folder with listings, dreams printed on paper, neat and harmless. If you'd asked me then, I would have told you we'd earned our quiet. The first crack was money, though I didn't see it as a crack at the time. Linda started saying the library had cut her hours. I didn't question it. Budget cuts happened. Then she mentioned a short-term loan from a friend to help cover Maggie's car repairs. It sounded like the ordinary mess of adulthood, but the mail started arriving in stiff white envelopes with aggressive fonts. I wasn't snooping. I was sorting. That's what husbands say when they're about to admit they were snooping. There was a notice about a past due credit card I didn't recognize. Then another. Then a final warning about a home equity line of credit. My stomach did that slow, sinking thing, like an elevator deciding it didn't like you anymore. When I asked Linda, she didn't meet my eyes. She stood at the sink, hands submerged in soapy water, as if the truth might be floating there. "Oh, those," she said lightly. "It's paperwork confusion. I'll handle it." I wanted to believe her because believing is cheaper than panic. A week later, I checked the accounts. The numbers stared back like missing teeth. We weren't just short. We were bleeding. That night, I pressed again. She snapped, not loud, but sharp. "Why are you auditing me like I'm a stranger?" Because that's exactly what you feel like when the person you trust has built a second life in the shadows. I slept on the couch, not out of principle, out of exhaustion. The pawn shop was my breaking point. I was delivering a small job near Maple Grove when I saw it, a familiar circle of gold on black velvet. I knew it the way you know your own hands. I'd picked that ring out in 1986 with a fear so bright it could have lit the store. I walked in like a man stepping onto thin ice. The clerk was a bored kid with a nose ring and the kind of detachment that comes from seeing other people's regrets all day. "Where'd that ring come from?" I asked. He checked the tag. "Sold yesterday. Woman, late 50s, brown hair. Linda." I bought it back without haggling. I could have argued the price, but I was too busy trying not to vomit. The drive home was a blur of red lights and memories. The ring sat in my cup holder like a small, gleaming betrayal. When I held it out to her in the kitchen, she went pale in a way that made me feel cruel for existing. "You sold your wedding ring," I said. Her mouth opened, closed, a trapped animal deciding which direction might hurt less. "We needed money," she finally whispered. "For what?" She didn't answer. I heard myself say a sentence that sounded like my father. "If you won't tell me, I'll find out." The next morning, I did the thing I never thought I'd do. I went through her desk. I found a manila envelope stuffed with receipts, wire transfers, and handwritten notes. There was a name repeated like a prayer, Calvin R. Morrow. And then I found the photo, a smiling young man, early 30s, standing beside Linda at what looked like a hospital entrance. Her hand was on his shoulder, a gesture too intimate to be accidental. On the back she'd written, "We'll get him through this. Him, not us, not me. Him." Calvin was not her lover. He was her first son, the one she never told me about. I sat in the garage for a long time. The door opened just enough to let cold air needle my face. My thoughts came in waves: anger, confusion, pity, then anger again, because rage is easier than grief. Linda had been 17 when she got pregnant. Her parents sent her to a home for unwed mothers. She gave the baby up and never spoke of it again. Not to me, not to our children, not to anyone who mattered. Until last year. Calvin had found her through an adoption registry. He'd been diagnosed with a rare form of kidney failure. He needed treatment, travel, help. He needed what our health system likes to call support, which is a polite word for money. And Linda, who had carried that secret like a stone in her chest for 4 decades, cracked open. She didn't want to tell me because she was ashamed. She didn't tell me because she was afraid I'd judge her. But the real truth, raw and ugly, was that she didn't trust me to stay. I had spent most of my life believing I was the safe place. When I confronted her with the envelope, she sank into a chair like her bones had finally given up. "I tried to tell you," she said, 100 times. "Then why didn't you?" "Because every time I looked at you, I saw the life I was supposed to have. The life I didn't deserve after what I did." "You were a kid," I said, but my voice was too sharp. "You didn't do something evil. You survived something hard." She shook her head. "You don't understand. When he called me Mom the first time, I couldn't breathe." She'd taken out loans, maxed cards, sold jewelry, lied to our daughter about temporary issues, told the bank I was aware of the home equity line. She had gambled our future on a son she'd grieved in private for 40 years. Part of me admired her devotion. Part of me wanted to scream. Maggie discovered the financial mess 2 days later when the bank called her by mistake. She came over in a fury, a storm in a winter coat. "You lied to me," she told Linda. Linda didn't defend herself. She just looked tired. And Maggie turned to me with a look that said I was guilty by association. That was the moment I realized secrets don't just damage marriages. They rearrange entire families. We had a meeting at the hospital in the city. I went with Linda, not because I was noble, but because I couldn't stand the idea of her making another desperate decision alone. Calvin was thinner than the photo, the kind of thin that suggests your body has been negotiating with pain for years. He stood when we entered. He looked at Linda like she was a miracle with a pulse. Then he looked at me. I expected jealousy in myself. I expected resentment. What I felt instead was something worse, the sharp grief of a man realizing how many versions of his wife he never got to know. Calvin thanked me for coming. He was polite, gentle, the kind of man who had learned to soften his needs because life had already hit him enough. During the consult, the doctor went through options, treatment plans, costs, timelines. The numbers were brutal. Linda's hand was shaking under the table. On the drive home, she said quietly, "I'm thinking of selling the house." The sentence punched the air from my lungs. That house is our retirement. It's his life. And what about the children we already raised, the life we built? She turned to me, eyes wet but steady. "I'm asking you to help me do the right thing." I pulled over. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Cars flew past like they had places to be that weren't moral crossroads. Finally, I said, "You should have trusted me with this from the start." "I know, and I can't promise I won't be angry for a long time." "I know that, too." I stared at the steering wheel like it might offer wisdom. Then I said the only honest thing left in me. "We're not selling the house, but we're not abandoning him either." We met with a financial advisor. We called Eric. We sat with Maggie and told the full story, the shameful, complicated truth. The kids were furious, then heartbroken, then quietly practical, because that's what grown children do when their parents stop being myths and start being human again. The plan we built wasn't perfect. It was messy, patched together with savings, adjusted expectations, and a humbled kind of love. Calvin's treatment started in January. Linda visited every week. I went with her when I could. The day he finally stabilized, Linda cried into my shoulder in the hospital hallway, the way she had once cried when our daughter was born, overwhelmed by relief, stunned by grace. Months later, back at home, she asked if I could forgive her. I thought about the pawn shop, the lies, the fear in her voice when she said she didn't trust me to stay. I can forgive you, I said, but I need you to understand something. What? Love without honesty isn't safety. It's just a longer fall. She nodded like that sentence hurt and healed at the same time. We still have the folder of coastal condos. The dream is smaller now, more careful. But sometimes when I see Linda texting Calvin in the living room, laughing softly like she's reclaiming a stolen decade, I feel something I didn't expect. Not just acceptance, pride. Because life doesn't always test your love with temptation. Sometimes it tests it with inconvenient compassion, with the past showing up at the door, asking to be counted. I keep her ring in a small box by our bed, not as evidence, as a reminder that the scariest confessions can still be the doorway back to each other, if you choose truth over pride and family over the illusion of a perfect story.